and welcome to Parallel Session C, Students at the Heart of the Community. We have two sets of presenters this morning, and I'll introduce the first of them to you shortly, and then the second pair a little bit later. How we're going to structure things with the agreement of our presenters is that the first panel will present for us up to 20 minutes, and we'll have 10 minutes discussion, and then we'll ask our second panel to present with the same structure. And then we'll take questions and discussion, conversation at the end of their presentations in turn. So let me introduce you to our first panel, who are speaking on the subject, what do we know about how students learn at a distance? And they are Dr. David Baume and Professor Stephen Brown. David is a long-standing independent international higher education researcher, evaluator, consultant, staff and educational developer and writer. And he's a visiting fellow at the Centre for Distance Education in the University of London. And he was the founding chair of the UK Staff and Educational Development Association and of the Educational Development Group Heads. And his contributions to academic development have been recognised by both of those bodies. Professor Stephen Brown is Emeritus Professor of Learning Technologies at the De Montfort University, also a Fellow at the Centre for Distance Education at the University of London, and Director of the Learning Media Design Consultancy Hyperworks Limited. He's held a number of positions at De Montfort University and was also Senior Technology Advisor at the JISC Technologies Centre, Head of Distance Learning at British Telecoms, and the Royal Academy of Engineering Visiting Professor in Engineering Design, and also President of the Association for Learning Technology. So can I invite David and Stephen to make their presentation now on the subject, what do we know about how students learn at a distance?
Thank you for such fulsome introductions, Alan. So I'm Stephen Brown, and David's going to just say hello.
No more than I'm David Baume. Hi, it's good to be with you, Stephen.
Thanks, David. So let me now share my slides and we'll make a start. What do we know about how students learn at a distance? This presentation is going to be talking about what we've learned from a study of 4 distance learning courses at the University of London, looking at how the students study in terms of the amount of time they spend, when they spend that time, their study approaches, and what they find helpful in engaging with those courses and with each other. And although this is about distance learning courses, we feel that it has a wider relevance because, of course, over the last year, everybody's moved into distance learning by necessity because of the effects of the COVID pandemic. So we'll talk a little bit about the background to the study, the methodology, the key findings, and in particular, we want to look at some possible reasons for the divergence we found between the findings in this study about what students value and published research into student learning, which stresses the value of active learning activities and student collaboration. In terms of why we're looking at how students study, it was because we are aware from the research literature that the more distance learning students engage with their courses, the better their academic achievement tends to be. Where in terms of engagement, what we mean is the amount of time that they spend on learning tasks, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the extent to which they are active learners, engaging in more than just reading and memorizing. So we thought it was important, therefore, to have a better understanding of how students on these courses were engaging with them.
You'll have your own questions about how students learn and about what we can discover about this from distance education, but here are 2 questions we'll be giving consideration to. I generally won't read the slides. I'll let you read them. Think about these questions though in your own context, in your own setting. Try and make connections between what we're saying and your own issues and your own concerns, because that'll make it more useful. Next slide, please, Stephen. These are the research questions which we started to address. We were asked to consider these questions because the answers may have implications for the design and operation of distance learning programs. Methodology. Most of the answers come from a large online survey of participants in 4 University of London distance learning programs, but we also managed a small number of self-completed student learning diaries and also a small number of interviews with students to flesh out, to add richness and detail to the large amount of data we got from the survey. Stephen.
So let's go to the first research question then, and that is, how are the students studying? And the first aspect of this is, well, how long do they study for? From this slide here, you can see we've got 4 courses, course A, B, C, and D. What the courses actually were is not important here. And the blue bars for each of these courses represent the recommended or the expected average study time for these courses. And the red bars in each case indicate the proportion of students who spent less than the expected or recommended average study time, and the yellow bars indicate those who spent more. And we can see that the courses fall into 2 groups. The courses A and B on the left, clearly a large proportion of students spend rather less than the expected or recommended average study time studying those courses. And in courses C and D, the opposite effect is true, that a significant proportion of students spend rather more study time than is expected. Nevertheless, when you look at courses A and B, you can still see that although a lot of students on those courses are spending less than the expected study time, nevertheless, there's still quite a proportion of students who are spending more, around about 20%. So what we can conclude from this is that perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a great deal of variation in study time across these programs and across the students, given that the response to the questionnaire we put out was nearly 650 students. You'd expect a degree of variation. But nevertheless, one of the overarching messages that came through from the survey responses by the students was, there is just too much material to go through and not enough time in which to study it all. And that raised in our minds the question of, well, why is that? Is it simply because there is just too much content, or is something else going on? And we're going to try and dig into that in the rest of this presentation. The second aspect of how do they study is, what are their study approaches? We looked at how long they spent, but how are they actually doing it? And there was, again, a wide variation in the responses that we got, bearing in mind that these responses were not drawn from the survey, but drawn from the learning diaries that we asked students to complete. You can see a tiny fragment of one of these diaries on the right-hand side of the screen. We asked them to tell us when they started studying each session, when they finished, what they were looking at, to comment on it. And the responses we got showed that in some cases, students were incredibly well organized. They had fixed study times, regular slots. They had a high degree of self-awareness about how they were going about their study, and they approached things in a very strategic way, looking at the learning outcomes, looking at the examination question samples that were available on the courses, and making strategic decisions about how to allocate their time and effort. And at the other end of the spectrum, there were students who were really quite the opposite of that. And they did not have regular study slots. Sometimes they would study for very long periods of time, sometimes only for very short periods at different times of the day or night. And they seemed to have very low self-awareness as regards how they were going about things and how well they were doing. Interestingly, a number of the students talked about their learning as a way of kind of playing with the learning material, an exploratory learning approach, which picks up on one of the comments made by Ellen Helspert earlier this morning in the keynote presentation for this conference, talking about the playfulness of learners when they are more confident about what it is they're doing and how they're approaching their study. And the last intriguing thing that came out of looking at the diaries was that in some cases, at least, the way students study not only differs between students, but it can differ for an individual student themselves, because it evolves over time as they become more experienced. So that is a brief run through what we discovered looking at how students were studying. Next, we're going to go on and look at their responses to the different kinds of course components on offer and what they found most useful.
We asked the students which of the main elements of the course they found the most useful. This isn't the same as what were the most useful elements. This is students' perceptions of what they found most useful. And they fell into these three neat columns. And when you start looking at them, something interesting emerged to us, something interesting and frankly a bit alarming. They valued most content in the form of textbooks, previous exam papers, essential readings. They moderately found useful the things in the middle column. Considering the amount of time and effort and cost that goes into producing videos, that's slightly depressing results for the video makers in the middle column. And in the right-hand column, we find two things they valued least. And on a very elementary analysis, this tells us two crucial depressing things. One, they value content over activities and processes. And within activities and processes, they value solo, individual activities and processes over collaborative and shared one. Why is that depressing? Because the research which Stephen referred to earlier says very strongly that active learning, engagement, undertaking appropriate activities, working with others is a very, very productive form of learning. So we have a clash here. We have a mismatch between what students report finding most useful and what the research says students find more useful. Next slide, please, Stephen. Summary of the findings. Again, I'll let you read that and then maybe say a couple of things about them. What's going on here, I think, is that the students have a strange view of pedagogy. They have a different view of pedagogy from the course designers. We'll come back to that. Amount of study content's a significant challenge because of what the students choose to do with the content, and what they seem to choose to do with the content, a lot of them, is to try and memorize it, to try and learn it. And of course, if you're trying to memorize everything in the course, that's a huge contribution to the workload. So as kind of tentative or interim finding is the last point there. There's a clash of pedagogy between the course and the pedagogy that the students bring.
So we asked you to think about a couple of questions as we were going through this presentation, and we'd be very interested in the questions that follow to hear your ideas about how we can answer these questions. But we do have some thoughts ourselves, which I'd just like to go through fairly briefly. Obviously, we need to explain to students that learning is an active process. We can't assume that they're aware of that from their previous learning experiences in school or whatever. So we need to explain it, and we need to illustrate it, that it's not just about reading stuff, remembering it. We need to include, therefore, learning outcomes, explicit learning outcomes, which are about doing stuff as well as knowing stuff. And it's only fair, if those are the learning outcomes of the course, that we match those learning outcomes to appropriate activities to help them learn in that way, and assessment questions, so that they and we can see that they are developing the appropriate skills. And again, it's only fair that we make the benefits of these learning activities clear to learners, so that we explain and we demonstrate how performing these kinds of learning activities will contribute to their overall success on the course and indeed thereafter. And again, in terms of addressing the issue of the differing degrees of self-awareness that we observed in the learning diaries, it would make sense to, we think, to include activities explicitly to help learners develop and monitor their own learning skills. By that, we don't mean some kind of bolt-on study package, but we mean embedding the development of learning skills within the learning activities that are part of the course. And then related to that first question is specifically, how can we enhance students' willingness to engage with peers more effectively? Because very clearly from the research that we've done, there's a high degree of reluctance to do so. And again, clearly we think we need to reinforce specific student engagement skills such as leadership, trust building, and so on in the learning activities that we provide. And students do need to understand that they are individually accountable for their contributions to shared work. One of the frequent complaints we've heard from students is, well, I was in a group and the others didn't pull their weight, so in the end I stopped contributing myself. And it's a vicious circle in that case. And we need to encourage students to reflect on just what's been happening within their group as they've been going through the learning activities, and design activities, above all, design activities to ensure that students have a positive experience when they interact with their peers. So, as I say, we'd be interested in your thoughts also to the answer to these questions, but stepping back now to the bigger picture of what do we know about how students learn at a distance? What do we think has been happening here? David?
We've hinted at some of these on the way through, but let's just put them all up, Stephen, rather than doing that rather tantalising, revealing thing. Great. Again, take a moment to read through these and take a moment to think, what results would I get if I did this survey in my course? And also, what are the implications of this for the design and operation of my course? So that's what we currently think is going on.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both indeed. That's absolutely fascinating. I found that. I can't see any questions in Q&A or indeed in chat. So I'm going to, even though we've got 71 participants, which is great. So let me start off by beginning the conversation just for the next 10 minutes that we have available to us. The thing that I found most absorbing in what you discovered was the clash, what you call the clash of pedagogy, is the fact that students say they prefer to manage their learning and progress through the course in one way, and the teachers, the course designers, say they prefer to do it in a different way. And that is a clash which I guess all of us have encountered in our teaching. It's a very difficult one. I wondered if you thought this was related to some of the other concepts that we've had in the field, like sort of deep and surface learning, or a kind of instrumental approach by some students that, you know, their major priority is to get through the course and get the credit. Whereas professors, of course...
I think it does, Alan. I think you're right. I think also that we've got to remember one important thing. We're not being critical of students in saying this, and we really aren't. We're describing what they tell us they find useful. And the other thing to remember, perhaps, is that these students coming to the university to study have been successful throughout their schooling, most of them, to the point where they've gained admission to the University of London. So what they're telling us is what they have learned from all their years of schooling. And they've brought these learnings about pedagogy into their experience of being a student in the University of London. And we somehow haven't yet, I hate the commercial language, we haven't yet sold them. We haven't yet helped them to discover alternative, more productive pedagogies. I think I'll close with this thought. There's a conversation we don't have with students. We have lots of conversations about content. We very rarely have conversations about the most important thing they do, which is learning. But I'm sure Stephen will want to add to that.
I've got a couple of questions come up in Q&A as well. So go ahead, Stephen, and then I've got a really difficult one for you. Go right ahead, Stephen.
No, let's go for the difficult question.
Okay, so here's a really penetrating question, but difficult one to answer. Why are University of London exam grades determined solely by exams when active learning should be valued and assessed.
Does this assume that examinations cannot assess active learning? That seems to be an implication in the question, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So I think lying behind the question, and I'm not trying to dodge it, honestly, lying behind the question may be the issue that we need to look at what it is examinations are endeavoring to assess. And that takes us back to what we were talking about earlier about looking at the stated learning outcomes of the course. If the course learning outcomes are more performative, that is to say, they're more about doing stuff rather than remembering or knowing stuff, then it is only fair that the examinations should in fact assess that kind of thing. And so we need to look at how we match the assessment to the learning outcomes, which of course we all know that that's a basic principle of learning design. Does that help?
Well, the questioner is anonymous, so I can't ask him or her. David, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, we're not, this is a beyond London statement. This is a higher education statement. We're not always very good at specifying appropriate learning outcomes. And almost fortunately, we're not always very good at assessing the stated ones. At higher education, students should be working at a high level. They shouldn't just be remembering. You shouldn't just be able to get a degree for knowing a bunch of stuff, or even just for understanding a bunch of stuff. You should be able to analyze, explain, evaluate, use, synthesize new. You should be able to work at high academic levels, and all of those things can be tested in an examination. But what I think we're seeing with the obsession with content is students think they can get a degree by knowing, forgive the crude language, but I think it's expressive, by knowing a bunch of stuff. And it would be depressing if they were right.
One of the positive outcomes of COVID-19, which is a kind of odd sentence, I never thought I'd say that, has been just how creative people have been in response to the limitations imposed by the need to move online. And there have been a whole bunch of really exciting experiments in assessment, looking at how you might assess practical skills. I'm thinking particularly of medics, where with clever use of pre-recorded video scenarios and that combined with live video conferencing, it's been possible to get students, for example, to do clinical assessments of patients and to recommend treatments, and also to demonstrate that their practical physical skills.
Stephen, can I just ask you to hold that thought, because I've got a very good and related question from Kalina Zlatkova. I'll just read it. When we look at embedding employability in colleges within the University of London and institutions which are predominantly academically led, how can we match these learning approaches to the skills agenda in how we work with academics and teach skills learning approaches that would also be relevant to the world of work and reflective of industrial requirements? Stephen, I think that builds on what you were saying.
Yes, I think it does. And so thank you, Kalina, for a great question. I think it's a matter of choice and the extent to which the program team who put the program together are aware of, alert to, and willing to work with the potential industrial or employment partners to build in the appropriate relevant learning outcomes to the thing, so that the program does address the skills agenda of the industrial partners.
If you talk to employers, they don't just want people who know a bunch of stuff. They want people who can do things. The employment agenda is very similar indeed to the kind of high-level learning outcomes which we would want graduates to be achieving. There isn't a problem there, except that sometimes there's this kind of academic drift. Always, always, always. I don't understand it. Whatever our big intentions for our educational work, we sometimes drift back towards knowledge, towards knowing. It's not inevitable at all, but it kind of happens, and we need to be endlessly alert to it.
Okay, we've got a very good set of questions building up, so let me just try and make as much progress as I can. So a question from L. Merlin. I'm sorry, I don't have a first name for you. How can we help students feel more comfortable with the uncomfortable? For example, collaboration. How can we get them to enjoy that process? David, do you want to kick off on that one?
Yes, great question. Give them education's a process of development and growth, and the process is always the same. Start small and get bigger. Start with a 5-minute relevant activity, which cannot fail to be enjoyable. And then the next time, a 10-minute activity, which is productive and enjoyable. Start small, get bigger, be explicit about the skills required, encourage an honest emotional response to activities. If people found something uncomfortable, say so, try to analyse why. We need to be explicit about these things, but my summary is start small and grow steadily. If the first experience of group work is a week-long project and it's a bad experience, some people may be scarred for life, or at any rate for the duration of the course. We can avoid this.
I think just to add to that, I'd say in complete agreement, and it's implicit in what David's saying, but structure the activity. You've got to, it won't just happen. You've got to think very carefully about what's got to be done by when and how. So that's one thought. And the other thought is try and give the participants as much control over the process as possible. And that's not in conflict with what I've just said, but you'll know it yourself. The more you feel in control of something, the more comfortable you feel with it. I think. Okay,
well, there's some great comments and questions in the Q&A for people who've got time to look at them. I think we've got time for one last question to you both from Preethi. And it takes you back to something you said at the very beginning. Do you feel whether the student preference of learning methodology would change if it was regular students in the university who have now, because of COVID, gone online, as opposed to students who are regular distance education students, and their preference for content and with a low preference for peer learning and discussion?
Okay, short answer. I'm not sure. This is going to sound weird. I'm not sure that the experience of students on what we think of as traditional, conventional face-to-face education is actually hugely different from the experience of students online. They're doing the same things, it's just they're doing more of it on a screen and less of it individually. So I'm not sure that this would make a great difference, but gosh, that would be a fascinating empirical study to do.
Yeah, last word to you, Stephen.
Well, when you look at what's been happening prior to COVID-19, I would suggest strongly that there's been a growing trend towards more and more online learning activity in traditional face-to-face institutions. And what COVID-19 has done is accelerate that process, but not created a radical change. And so I suggest that, well, I suspect that there would not be great differences between the two student populations.
Okay, very good. Yes, as David says, it would be great to find out, wouldn't it? Okay, well, thank you both, David and Stephen, very much. That was a fascinating talk, and you can see the evidence for how fascinating it was in the Q&A, which is very engaged. So let me come to the second half of this session now and introduce two colleagues to you and ask them to present. So they are, firstly, Mario Barahona Quesada from the State Distance University, the Universidad Estatal at Distancia from Costa Rica. And secondly, Gina, and welcome, Gina. I'm sorry you had problems getting in, Gina, but very good to see you. Gina Patricia Suárez, España, from the Universidad ECCI, which is a professional private university in Bogotá, Colombia. And Mario and Gina are going to speak on the subject towards a framework for developing digital learning competences in higher education. Gina, I wasn't able to say this to you. If you and Mario could restrict your comments to 20 minutes, then we will have 10 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So over to Mario and Gina. Okay, let me just give you a short introduction. So Mario is a researcher at the research program on foundations of distance education at Costa Rica's State University of Distance Education. And he's particularly interested in the interplay of language, culture, and cognition in learning contexts. And Gina is a researcher in pedagogical innovation and a teacher of digital resources applied to education. Gina is a biologist by background and a specialist in teaching innovation. So over to you, Mario and Gina.
Okay.
Good morning.
Gina, it's going to introduce us. Good morning. Best regards to all people that are here today. Today, we will be talking about our research title toward and framework for developing digital learning competences in higher education. We are Mario Barahona from the Distancia State University, UNED of Costa Rica, and me, Gina Suárez, from the ECCI University located in Colombia. Online learning has become an important allied tool of education that promotes the development of skills and competences in the teaching and learning process. That is the reason why it is necessary to build a framework in which teachers and students can be able to self-manage the online learning process and enrich their knowledge through the internet. In this sense, it is proposed that technological tool be taken as the main source of learning processes. General objective: create a framework for digital learning competences development in higher education. Study objective: identify digital learning competences in the agents involved in digital spaces. Design and procedure: the use technique for data collection was online survey from Google Forms. The survey was applied to students of the online courses of the ECCI University and the UNED University during the academic periods of the 2019. The data were collected from May 5 to June 22 of the year 2020. Sample: for the selection of participants in each university, we use a stratified and random sampling according to the distribution by gender. The total sample was of 347 students, 171 women and 176 men. From the ECCI, 133 women and 141 men. And from the UNED, 38 women and 35 men in the ages between 18 and 61 years old. Instruments: the questionnaire that was finally applied was made of 10 demographic and academic classification variables and 100 elements based on the experiences of the student on the online courses. Depending on the content of the items, they were used 5 points, with a conformity scale where 1 equal disagreement and 5 agrees of the items, 7 to 10 and 34 to 40, a frequency scale where 1 equal never and 5 equal always.
Okay, now I will continue with our analytic strategy. Okay, for the analysis, we use non-parametric techniques such as Mann-Whitney U-test and Spearman correlations in the case of single items. We use principal component analysis with orthogonal rotation, varimax rotation, and reliability analysis to get multivariate analysis. And for the resulting components, we use parametric analysis such as Welty test to compare means between groups, and Pearson correlations to measure the association between age and the scores we get. In both cases, we use bootstrap confidence intervals to correct for the difference in sample sizes between groups. Retained components. As you see, we performed a PCA. So we retained it after all 9 components, which explained approximately 58% of the variance of the total data. These components are orientation in virtual courses and classrooms, active learning, usability, accessibility, and satisfaction, institutional support and intelligent agents, organization and planning, linguistic expression and instructions understanding, real-time interaction, communication, regulation, and fluency, and collaborative work. Then, as you could see in the columns to the right, there is the number of items that were in each component. Then there is the lower bounds of the factor loadings for each component, and the Cranbach's alpha, which is the measure of reliability we used. In the rightmost column, you could see the scores we got in each of these components. As you could see, linguistic expression and instructions understanding is the one which gets the higher scores. And the second one is orientation in virtual courses and classrooms. The lowest scores were found in real-time interaction, and it followed by institutional support and intelligent agents. We will see more in more detail every component in what follows. The first component was supposed to measure participants' self-perceived skills to navigate, orient themselves, understand levels of organization, and interact with different resources in virtual learning environment. So it is related to how you manage through the courses, how you manage to use the platform and stuff. Our key findings, according to the predictors we used that were university of affiliation, gender, and age, we got the following. In the first place, we found higher average scores among UNED and female students. We found increasing scores with age in men, and we found constant scores across age in women. As you could see, even though female students got an average, higher average in this component, with age, men come to get higher scores at the end of the age scale. For active learning, we measured participants' perceived opportunities to develop critical thinking, reflect on their own learning strategies, apply new knowledge, carry out research and collaboration activities, and receive feedback and follow up in virtual courses. This is what our colleagues were talking in the previous presentation, I think. As key findings, we found higher average scores in UNED again, higher but not significant scores in women, and increasing scores with age in both female and male students. In the case of usability, accessibility, and satisfaction, what we assessed was participants' perception of usability and accessibility in virtual learning environments and general satisfaction with their experience in them. In this case, we found again higher average scores in UNED, higher but not significant scores in men, and increasing scores with age in both female and male students. As you could see in almost every component, the age has an effect of increasing in scores. So we will talk about this later, but it would be interesting to look out what is really age doing there. Institutional support and intelligent agents. we measured participants' perceptions of the support services provided by their institution in virtual platforms and the presence of intelligent agents for improving the learning experience in such environments. As you could see, we didn't find differences by age. All scores are almost constant, and even there is a little higher scores in UNED and in females. These are not non-significant, so there was common agreement between all participants in this component. Organization and planning. What was measured was participants of perceived skills to make the most of inquiry spaces, use tools for organizing and planning their learning process, and meet study goals during virtual courses. It's related to the activity of get everything in order and how to plan your process during the course. Our key findings were higher average scores in the case of UNED, higher non-significant scores in women, increasing scores with age in women, and constant scores across age in men. In the case of linguistic expression and instructions understanding, we assess participants' self-perceived skills to use written language, understand instructions and guidance, and respond on time in virtual learning environments. In this case, which is the component which has the highest scores of all, what we found was higher average scores among UNED and female students. In both cases are significant. Increasing scores with age in the case of men, and constant scores across age in the case of women. Real-time interaction was the component which has the lowest score of all. As we could see through the questionnaire, students really miss this opportunity to interact in real time, at least participants in this study. So what we assessed was their perceptions of the opportunities provided by virtual courses to interact synchronously with teachers or peers. In this case, what we found was higher average scores in UNED. Again, as you could see, UNED has the higher scores basically in every component, and higher but non-significant scores in men. We have also increasing scores with age in women and decreasing scores with age in the case of men. Communication, regulation, and fluency. In this case, we measured participants' perceptions of the appropriate use of communication channels and the fluency of communicative exchanges in virtual learning environments. In this case, nothing was really significant, even though we have higher average scores in the case of UNED and in the case of female students, almost constant scores across age in both females and male. Collaborative work. In this case, we measured participants' perceptions of the possibilities offered by virtual learning environments to develop collaborative activities among peers during courses. In this case, we actually find higher average scores in the case of UNED, and increasing scores with age in both genders. Let's see, as some conclusions. When we analyze scores by component at the overall level, We could find that students tended to feel more comfortable with their linguistics and orientation skills in virtual environments than with the rest of the dimensions we assessed. In contrast, they seem to miss real-time interaction and institutional support in these virtual platforms. In the case of university differences, higher scores among UNED students in all 9 components, even when in some cases differences were not significant, the trend was that UNED has higher scores in all 9 components. Maybe this is due to differences in the educational model of each university. While UNED is a fully distance education institution, ECCI is a traditional university that offers several online courses. So we guess that participants in the study were more used to distance education than in the case of ECCI. In UNED, nevertheless, even that it is fully distance, is not a fully digital education university. It's a distance education university and has obviously an important digital component. However, we think students may be more used to the dynamics of studying at distance and virtual. In the case of scores by gender, with the exception of these 3 components, UAS, which was usability, accessibility, and satisfaction, real-time interaction, and collaborative work, female students tended to score higher in the remaining 6 components. It would be worth to conduct further research on gender-specific psychological traits associated with digital learning competences. This is true because given the data we have, it would be interesting to know why there are those differences. So we should take this further. In the case of scores by age, except in the case of institutional support and intelligent agents and communication, regulation, and fluency, scores tended to increase with age, either in female or male students. It will be important to further explore if these changes are related to maturation itself, to experience, or to any other confounding variable associated with age. This is another open question we have with our data, because some scores change across ages, but we are not really sure that is age alone, which is exerting influence in this case. So we would like to further explore this. And well, as further directions, regarding the sample, we would like to reproduce this study with a larger sample because, as you could see, even though it's a reasonable sample, it's not large enough to dig in data as we would like, and if possible, including more institutions to have more points of comparison. In the case of the instrument, we would like to conduct the survey using the revised version of the questionnaire, because the first one had 100 items. We reduced it to 84, and we think there are some items we could even eliminate. In the case of control, we would like to include controls for exposition to educational models. As we saw, there is a guess that the educational model is playing a role in scores we get. Also, in the case of experience in digital learning, we would like to apply controls for this, and obviously for balancing the size of groups to get more accurate measurements in all the data. And there is some contact information to stay in touch with us, and this is it by now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mario and Gina. It's great to have live presentations from Latin America. This makes it a very interesting international meeting. And I must say,
Thank you very much.
Must thank Mario and Gina for starting your day so early, as you must have done. We appreciate that, we really do. Okay, so we've got a quick question from Preethi on the question and answer about whether there are any links to publications of these research studies, and maybe you could put an answer to that in the question and answer. That applies to Stephen and David as well as Mario.
Yeah, we right now we haven't formally published these results. There is a report, but it's by now written in Spanish, so we will translate it in some time.
Thank you.
Not too soon, but we are going to do this, and we are going to maybe to publish some results in English as well. So it would be great to share this with you at the time they are available.
Thank you. But here's a question for you, Mario and Gina.
Thank you.
How have you had any thoughts about how you might apply the findings that you have into the design of successful courses? How could you make your findings applicable to people who design courses?
That's the $1 million question always. How to apply, right? We are right now in the phase of analysis, as you could see, and we are not working directly in application stuff, but we think we think we should start with some kind of workshop. I don't know, with teachers and with the professionals in the curricular design, who could better than us see where they could apply these findings. But we are very interested in first place to get better results and better measures in the first place, and then to try to share it with people at course design that could better understand how they could apply this. We are not actually experts in that area, so there are some blind spots that we have right now. But it would be I think through workshops that we could share these with people at design.
Okay, thank you. We've also got a question, I think it's a related question, from Linda Amron Cooper, who asks whether there are particular implications for your research in developing your own virtual learning environments at your two universities.
Right now, I think the question goes in the same direction. Is part of how to apply this. We think that the first we need to think is to work in those bigger pains we have right now in terms of platforms or what data is telling us, that is to work in real-time interaction. It seems like students are missing this component, and we know right now that it is not impossible to include some more components of real-time interaction. And the other one is related to intelligent agents, but more importantly to institutional support, with presence in platforms. Right now, our platforms are mainly teacher managed. There is no how I'll say, important presence of institution in I don't know, a Q&A direct to the university or some stuff like that. So we think that in terms of platforms and technology, what we should work is in those areas. Try to include more components of real-time interaction and to show the presence of the institution or some place where you could interact in the course itself, or at least in the platform.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Mario and Gina. I'm going to conclude this session now. I think it has really lived up to its title of Students at the Heart of Learning. So I'd like to thank Mario and Gina, and secondly, David and Stephen, who are our first presenters, for your contribution today. They've been very helpful indeed. I'm going to close this session. You've just got time to grab a coffee before we resume at 11:40, when David will be chairing a session with Jonathan Baldwin of JISC. So you have 10 minutes to grab a coffee, and then we'll all meet each other again shortly. So thanks again to all of you.